Before Mother's Day 2020, Suzanne Morphew looked like the kind of woman you'd never expect to become a headline. 49 years old. A wife. A mother of 2 daughters. A life built in the quiet mountains of Colorado. In a place where people lock their doors more out of habit than fear. Where mornings smell like pine and dust, and neighbors measure time by seasons instead of news cycles. The kind of life that feels stable right up until the moment it isn't. Because the truth about missing person cases is this. When someone disappears, it rarely starts with the day they vanish. It starts earlier, in private, behind walls that don't talk. And in this case, the last known day wasn't just another day. It was Mother's Day. The kind of day that's supposed to end in phone calls, family photos, and predictable routines. Instead, it ended with an empty road, a missing woman, and a story that would shift, fracture, and evolve into one of the most argued, dissected, and emotionally charged disappearances in modern Colorado history. Suzanne was reported missing on May 10, 2020, a date that should have meant celebration, but became a timestamp. And it didn't take long for the case to catch fire, because searchers found what looked like the first clue. Suzanne's bicycle. Abandoned. Not with the kind of damage you'd expect from a real crash. Not with the kind of scene that says accident. And then came the helmet found separately. 2 objects that were supposed to tell one story, but instead created a different question entirely. Did Suzanne crash? Or was the crash staged? That single question split public opinion like a blade. And once the internet smells staging, it never lets go. In the first hours after the report, there was the usual hope, the kind families hold on to because they have no other choice. Maybe she got hurt and couldn't call. Maybe she wandered off the trail. Maybe her phone died. Maybe someone saw something. Maybe she would come home. But even early on, investigators didn't treat it like a simple accident, because the scene didn't read like one. People who ride know the difference between a wipeout and a placement, and what they were looking at felt placed. As days passed, the search widened. The story spread. And as it spread, the case began turning into something bigger than a missing biker. Because in disappearances like this, there's always a gravitational pull. The investigation starts outside the home, but it always circles back to the people closest to the missing person. Not because it's fair, not because it's guaranteed, but because history doesn't lie. Statistically, the person who knows the most is usually in the inner circle. And in Suzanne's case, that inner circle had one obvious name at the center. Barry Morphew, the husband, the man who would soon become the face of the case whether he wanted to or not. A week after Suzanne went missing, Barry Morphew posted a public plea for her safe return. A video that did what videos like that always do. It drew attention, it drew sympathy, and it drew scrutiny. Because when a spouse speaks to the camera in a missing person case, people don't just listen to the words. They listen to the pauses, the tone, the cadence, the choice of emotion, the choice of what not to say. They watch it like evidence. They freeze it like evidence. They replay it like evidence. And Barry's plea wasn't just a plea. It was also the moment millions of strangers decided they were now part of the investigation. But the real investigation wasn't happening in comment sections. It was happening in reports, interviews, timelines. And timelines are where this case started to become dangerous. Because a timeline is a simple thing until it isn't. It's supposed to be a straight line. Suzanne was here, then she went there, then she vanished. But in cases like this, the timeline behaves differently. It bends. It breaks. It changes shape depending on who is talking. And the moment a timeline starts shifting, the case stops being about where a person went and starts being about why the story can't stay still. According to reporting on the case's timeline, investigators identified a last selfie from Suzanne taken on May 9, 2020, the day before she was reported missing. The last image that showed her alive. A photograph that, in hindsight, becomes more than a photo. It becomes a marker, a final proof of existence. Because once someone is gone, the last confirmed sign of life becomes sacred. It becomes a wall the case leans on. And when you have a last photo, it sharpens the question even more. If she was alive on May 9, what happened between then and Mother's Day? As information emerged, it became increasingly clear that the Morphews' marriage was not as calm as the mountain air around them. Reporting later described marital problems. Suzanne's private life, which had stayed private until she vanished, began surfacing in public through court filings, investigative details, and media coverage. And when a missing person case reveals a troubled relationship, public perception changes fast. Sympathy becomes suspicion. Support becomes interrogation. Because people want a clean narrative. They want the missing person to be an angel and the spouse to be either a hero or a villain. But real life doesn't work that way. Real life is messy. And messy is where the best lies hide. The case escalated over the following year. There were searches. There were theories. There were rumors that filled the empty spaces that official statements could not. And in May 2021, almost exactly a year after Suzanne was reported missing, Barry Morphew was arrested and charged. Murder after deliberation, tampering with evidence, attempting to influence a public servant. That arrest was the moment the case crossed a line. Because arrests in missing person cases do two things. They validate suspicion, and they lock the narrative into a courtroom. And courtrooms demand specifics. They demand timelines that don't move. They demand evidence that holds weight. The state's theory, as described in coverage at the time, was that Barry was responsible. That Suzanne didn't vanish by accident. And for a moment, the world thought it would finally get the answers it wanted. But then something happened that cases like this rarely survive. The case unraveled before it could be tried. In 2022, the charges were dismissed as it neared trial, after issues involving the prosecution's handling of evidence and witnesses led to major problems in court. The case was abandoned, not because Suzanne returned, not because a new truth emerged, but because the process collapsed under its own failures. And that creates a new kind of nightmare, because now the public has seen an arrest. They've heard accusations. They've picked sides. And then the system says, we're not ready. We can't proceed. We can't finish. Imagine being a family waiting for closure and instead watching the entire structure shake. That dismissal didn't clear the case. It didn't answer the question. It just left a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. Over time, the disappearance turned into a long silence punctuated by occasional updates, the kind that keep a case alive in the public mind. And then, in September 2023, the silence broke. Suzanne Morphew's remains were found in southern Colorado, in Saguache County, during a search related to something else. More than 3 years after she vanished, there was finally confirmation. Suzanne had not run away, had not simply disappeared into a new life. She was dead, and her death was treated as a homicide. The discovery of her remains changed the entire landscape of the case. Because when you have no body, you have theories. When you have a body, you have a new layer of truth. But the body didn't give the kind of answers people wanted. Reports stated there were no obvious signs of trauma, no clean visual explanation. Instead, what emerged was something colder and more clinical, something that belongs to the world of forensic chemistry rather than dramatic crime scenes. Investigators reported that a combination of drugs, a tranquilizer cocktail used for wildlife and known as BAM, was found in Suzanne's bone marrow, butorphanol, azaparone, and medetomidine, and according to reporting, in their area Barry Morphew was the only person besides wildlife officials known to have a prescription for that cocktail. That detail is the kind of detail that changes a case. Not because it proves everything, but because it narrows the world. It turns a broad mystery into a smaller circle. And in investigations, circles are dangerous. Because the tighter the circle becomes, the harder it is to explain coincidence. Investigators also noted the possibility that Suzanne's body may have decomposed somewhere else before being moved, based on forensic analysis described in reporting. And if a body was moved, that suggests intention, planning, control, a person who wasn't just reacting but executing. And that is the core of why this case hits so hard. Not the violence itself, but the possibility of calculated concealment. A disappearance that doesn't just happen, but is managed. As the case developed, Barry Morphew would face charges again, this time in the jurisdiction where Suzanne's remains were found. That difference matters. different prosecutors, different approach, different teams stepping into a case that had already been damaged by its first collapse. And in early 2026, Barry entered a not guilty plea in the renewed prosecution, maintaining his innocence. So where does that leave the story? It leaves it exactly where the audience hates being left. In uncertainty. The woman is dead. The husband is charged again. The evidence is argued. And the timeline, the thing that should be the spine of the case, is still the battlefield. Because the biggest unanswered question remains simple and brutal. What happened inside that home, between the last confirmed signs of Suzanne alive and the moment the world realized she was gone? And to understand why this case still burns, we need to rewind, not to the day she vanished, but to the days when the story was still being written in private. Because the most important part of a disappearance isn't the search helicopters or the news coverage. It's the quiet moments before, the final conversations, the messages that don't look like evidence until they're all that's left. Reports in the case timeline describe text messages indicating Suzanne wanted out of the relationship, and that matters because separation, even the idea of it, can act like a fuse. Most breakups end in distance. Some end in court. Some end in silence. And some, in the worst cases, end in a missing person report that the world can't solve. If Suzanne believed she was at the edge of leaving, then the next question becomes darker. Did someone else believe he was at the edge of losing control? Because control is what this case feels like from the outside. A staged scene. A moved body. A story that changes shape. And when you put those together, you don't get a clean answer, but you get a pattern. And patterns don't scream. They whisper. They build. They wait. Now, before we go further, if you're still with me at this point, you're not here for gossip. You're here for investigation. So do this, subscribe, because this channel is going to be built on real cases, real timelines, and the details people skip. And I want you to comment something too. Not guilty or innocent. Not yet. Comment this. What do you think matters more in a missing case? Motive or opportunity? Because once we enter the next section, you're going to see exactly why that question matters, and why this case is less about one missing bike ride and more about what was happening in a marriage that, by all public appearances, was still standing. But behind appearances, things were breaking. And when things break in private, the first sign isn't always a fight. Sometimes it's a shift, a message that says the truth out loud for the first time, a realization that the future is changing. And if one person wants out while the other wants control, then Mother's Day becomes more than a date. It becomes the deadline no one agreed to, but someone acted on anyway. Because after Suzanne vanished, investigators didn't just search the woods. They searched the story. And the story, like the bike, didn't land like an accident. It landed like a decision. And if it was a decision, then the most terrifying possibility is this. Someone knew exactly what they were doing, and they believed they could get away with it. And if that's true, then the bicycle wasn't the beginning. It was the distraction. The helmet wasn't evidence of a crash. It was the prop. And Suzanne wasn't lost in the mountains. She was lost in a timeline that someone tried to control. In the early phase of the case, the public wanted an abduction narrative. A stranger on a road. A sudden attack. It's a story that feels safe because it keeps the danger outside the home. But law enforcement often sees something else. They see that most disappearances don't come from nowhere. They come from inside a system, a relationship, a financial pressure, a fear of exposure, a moment when someone believes the future is slipping away. In Suzanne's case, the future was unstable behind the scenes, as later reporting described marital tension and messages about ending the relationship. This matters because a missing person case isn't just a question of where a body is. It's a question of why someone would want that body to never be found. That's the part most people don't say out loud, but it sits beneath every conversation. Why would a person disappear and never return? Why would a scene look manufactured? Why would the last known day have gaps? When Barry Morphew was arrested in 2021, prosecutors believed they had enough to put him on trial. But then in 2022, the case collapsed due to prosecutorial failures described in coverage, and that collapse wasn't just legal, it was psychological. Because it created two separate realities. In one reality, Suzanne was a victim and Barry was responsible. In the other reality, the system failed so badly that it poisoned the public's confidence. And when confidence dies, truth becomes negotiable. People pick the version that feels right instead of the version that can be proven. That's why this case became a war online, and why it still is. But in September 2023, the war changed, because the remains were found. And when a missing person case becomes a death investigation, the rules change. It's no longer about search and rescue. It's about evidence and reconstruction. The remains were discovered in Saguache County, far from the home area, and according to reporting, investigators believed her body may have decomposed somewhere else before being moved. That detail is not a headline detail, but it is everything. Because it implies transportation, decision-making, and time. A body doesn't move itself. And moving a body means you are working against nature, against detection, against consequence. You're managing risk. You're cleaning up. You're trying to make the case unsolvable. Now imagine the mindset it takes to do that. Not panic, not rage, but calculation. The coroner ruled Suzanne's death a homicide by intoxication with a tranquilizer cocktail, BAM, involving butorphanol, azaparone, and medetomidine, a combination used to tranquilize wildlife. A combination not common in an average home. A combination that, according to reporting, Barry Morphew had rare access to through a prescription in their area. That is where the case becomes sharp. Because this isn't a Hollywood murder weapon. This isn't a gunshot or a blade. It's chemistry. It's quiet. It's clinical. It's the kind of method that doesn't create the kind of chaos neighbors can hear through walls. And that is why this case fits the domestic noir category so perfectly, because the terror here isn't a monster in the woods. It's the possibility of something unfolding inside an ordinary life, under an ordinary roof, and leaving almost nothing behind except questions. After the remains were found, prosecutors in a different jurisdiction moved forward again. And by early 2026, Barry Morphew entered a not guilty plea in the renewed prosecution, maintaining his innocence. That means the story isn't finished. The file isn't closed. And no matter what side people think they're on, the truth is still being fought for in a courtroom instead of being accepted as a finished chapter. But to understand why the Suzanne Morphew case still holds attention, you have to understand that people aren't addicted to the headline. They're addicted to the feeling that the truth is right there and still out of reach. This case has too many turns, too many shifting phases, too many moments where the public thinks the mystery is about to collapse into certainty, and then it opens again. It begins as a missing person report on Mother's Day 2020. It becomes a suspected staged scene with a bicycle and helmet found separately. It becomes a year-long storm of searches, rumors, and growing suspicion. It becomes an arrest in 2021. Then it becomes a collapse in 2022. Then it becomes a body found in 2023. Then it becomes a forensic revelation about tranquilizers in bone marrow. Then it becomes renewed prosecution. Each act pulls people back in. And the reason that works isn't because people love tragedy. It's because people need a resolution. Because unresolved stories feel like a threat. They make people feel unsafe. If someone can disappear from an ordinary life and the world can't agree on what happened, then what does that say about the illusion of stability? That's why audiences keep watching. That's why new documentaries keep being made. That's why the same case can be red ocean and still perform. Because when the packaging is right, the mystery becomes new again. And the packaging for this channel is simple. Family photo. A missing person. A question. A timeline that doesn't match the story. A file that refuses to close. Now step away from everything you've heard online and think like an investigator. The first job is to remove emotion from the evidence. That doesn't mean you don't care. It means caring can't control the direction of the work. You start with what can be confirmed. You anchor the case to fixed points. Suzanne alive on May 9, 2020, the last selfie investigators referenced in reporting. Suzanne reported missing May 10th. Bicycle found abandoned. Helmet found separately. A husband explaining what he believes happened. Community trying to help. Those are fixed points. Then you look at what isn't fixed. Gaps, contradictions, things that move. In investigations, the gaps are where the truth hides. Because people can lie about events, but lying always creates emptiness. It creates a missing link in the chain of time. And empty links attract attention. They force questions. The case drew suspicion toward Barry not only because he was the spouse, but because the narrative around the disappearance never sat still. When a story can't sit still, investigators don't ask, "Why is he nervous?" They ask, "Why is the timeline bending?" Because bending timelines are what guilt looks like in real life. Not always, but often. And the public loves to hunt for emotion, but investigators hunt for structure. They hunt for sequence. They hunt for the invisible logic behind every decision. If the bicycle was staged, what was it staged to say? If the helmet was placed away from the bike, what did that separation create? It created the image of movement and accident. It planted an explanation before investigators could reach their own. And that is the core suspicion in staging. It's not just about hiding a crime. It's about creating a story that delays the real one. Accident, abduction, anything that points away from the home and away from the spouse. Because time is the ally of whoever wants the truth buried. And buried truths are what make a case unsolvable. But Suzanne's remains being found destroyed one form of hiding. It brought the case back from rumor into forensics. And forensics doesn't care about opinion. Cares about what can be detected. And the detection here, the BAM tranquilizer cocktail, is one of the most haunting details because it suggests a quiet ending. A body that doesn't show obvious trauma, but shows something introduced into her system. And when an intoxicant shows up like that, the mind does something terrible. It imagines the moment. It imagines a needle. It imagines someone asleep, vulnerable, unaware. It imagines control. It imagines a kind of violence that doesn't look like violence, and that makes it worse. Because the absence of blood doesn't mean the absence of brutality. It just means the brutality was silent. If that's truly what happened, then the case isn't about a fight in the woods. It's about decisions made in private where the world couldn't see. And when people say, "I don't believe he did it," or "I know he did it," what they're really responding to is not proof. They're responding to the fear of domestic reality turning dark. Because this could have been any marriage, any home, any Mother's Day, any woman with 2 daughters and plans for tomorrow. That's why it's haunting. And it's also why the case became a battlefield the moment it hit public consciousness. Because public cases create tribes. People choose a narrative and defend it like identity. But a courtroom doesn't care about tribes. A courtroom cares about what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. That's why the 2022 dismissal mattered so much. Because people saw the case as solved when the arrest happened. And then the system said, "We can't proceed." And the public reacted like it always reacts when certainty is removed. It becomes louder. It becomes more confident. It becomes more extreme. Some said it was corruption. Some said it was incompetence. Some said it was innocence. But none of those words bring Suzanne home. None of those words answer what happened. They just keep the audience occupied while the case remains unresolved. Now imagine what that does to a family, to the daughters, to Suzanne's relatives, to everyone who knew her. Because while strangers argue online, families live inside the silence. They wake up to it. They eat with it. They breathe with it. And every time a new development happens, it doesn't feel like entertainment. It feels like a reopening of a wound that never closed. When Suzanne's remains were found in 2023, the wound reopened again. But this time it came with a terrible confirmation. She was gone. The missing person hope was over. The only thing left was justice, accountability, and whatever truth could still be pulled out of the years that had passed. And years matter, because time destroys evidence. It erases tracks. It breaks devices. It fades memories. It creates gaps that never existed in the first days. That's why some people believe the perfect crime is just a crime with enough time. Not because it's smart, but because time does what criminals can't. Cleans. It blurs. It softens. It makes certainty harder. That's why the idea of a body being moved is so important. If Suzanne's body decomposed somewhere else and was later transported, as reporting suggested investigators believed possible. Then someone was thinking in terms of time from the beginning. Someone was trying to control discovery, control location, control the way the case would unfold. And control is what investigators notice. In domestic cases, control is often the hidden motive. Not money, not jealousy, control. The refusal to be left. The refusal to lose the narrative. The refusal to accept a future that doesn't include them. And when control becomes desperate, it can become lethal. The same way a storm becomes a tornado when pressure builds in the wrong direction. Suzanne's case, according to public reporting, involved signs of a marriage under stress. The kind of stress that doesn't always show in public. Because families are good at appearing normal. Families are experts at smiling in photos while living in silence. That's why the photo angle works. Because the last photo is the lie we all want to believe. The idea that everything was okay right until it wasn't. And the channel's name, Family File Mysteries, is built for this kind of case because the case file truly starts at home. The key question of this story isn't who took Suzanne off the road. The key question is, what happened to Suzanne in the last private hours before she was reported missing? And every timeline detail matters because it tells you where those private hours may have gone. When investigators build cases like this, they don't rely on one smoking gun. They rely on accumulation. One inconsistency is nothing. 10 is a pattern. 100 is a story. That's why the public obsession with a single detail, like the bike, can be misleading. The bike might be staging or it might be chaos, but staging is only one chapter. The full story is in everything surrounding it: messages, tensions, last known contact, movement patterns, decisions made in the days after, and the way the narrative evolves when pressure arrives. Because pressure reveals truth. Not by making someone confess, but by forcing the mask to slip. And if you want to understand why this case still feels unresolved even with new charges, you have to accept the uncomfortable truth that some cases become larger than their evidence. They become a symbol. Suzanne became a symbol of missing mothers, of domestic danger, of the idea that a person can disappear in a place that looks safe. Barry became a symbol of the suspected spouse, the man every camera points at, the person the public measures with suspicion. The system became a symbol of failure when the first prosecution collapsed. And in symbolic cases, people stop listening to updates. They start reading meaning into every silence. That's why, even now, the case is still alive in a way many disappearances aren't. Because the story has not allowed itself to settle. But here's the reason this channel exists. Because the loudest part of the story isn't always the most important part. The important part is the quiet part. The part where Suzanne was still alive, still making decisions, still thinking about the future. The part where she was still a person with a life, not a case file. When you read and watch the public reporting around a case like this, you see something that happens every time. The missing person becomes a canvas. People paint theories on them. They paint morality on them. They paint innocence on them. They paint guilt on others. But Suzanne is not a canvas. She was a real person. She had habits. She had fears. She had private conversations. And those private conversations might be the most important evidence we'll ever know exists, because they point to motive and direction. If she wanted to leave, if she was unhappy, if she was planning something, then the disappearance becomes something else. It becomes an interruption. It becomes a cutoff. It becomes a decision made by someone who refused to allow that change. That doesn't automatically prove guilt, but it frames the psychological landscape of the case. And psychological landscapes are where domestic noir thrives. The case is terrifying not because of what is confirmed, but because of what is plausible. A quiet method, a staged scene, a body moved, a timeline bending, a public plea, an arrest, collapse, a remains discovery years later, a chemical signature that narrows access, a renewed prosecution. If you were writing fiction, people would call it exaggerated. But it's real life, and real life is allowed to be messy in ways fiction often isn't, because real life doesn't care if the story feels clean. It only cares that the story happened. Now imagine you're the person holding the case file folder, the kind we show in the thumbnails. Your job isn't to satisfy the public. It's to satisfy the evidence. You don't get to say, I feel like he did it. You have to say, I can prove he did it. That's why the case must be built on structure. The timeline, the movements, the access to unusual substances, the disposal theory, the chain of custody, the fact that the remains were found far away, the fact that the case moved jurisdictions. And each of those points matters because it represents another barrier. Another thing the prosecution must overcome. Another thing the defense can challenge. And that's why, for the audience, the case feels endless. Because it is now a long war between what seems likely and what can be proven. And those are not always the same thing. That's the tragedy of the justice system. Likely is not enough. Suspicion is not enough. Pattern is not always enough. But sometimes, if enough pieces lock together, the case becomes unavoidable. Suzanne's case is still in motion. It still has a future that could end in a verdict. But even if that happens, even if the system finally delivers a conclusion, this story will never be solved emotionally. Because the damage is already done. A mother vanished. Daughters lost her. Community was divided. A family's private life became public debris. And the world watched it like a series. But for the people inside it, it was never content. It was the day their life ended and turned into questions. That's why this channel is going to handle these stories differently. We don't turn them into spectacle. We turn them into investigation. We follow the timeline. We follow the contradictions. We follow the evidence. And we ask the questions that people avoid because they are too uncomfortable. The final question of this case isn't even about guilt. It's about inevitability. Was Suzanne's disappearance an eruption? Or was it the end of something that had been breaking for a long time? Because in domestic noir, the ending always feels sudden to outsiders. But to the people inside the house, it often feels like the final act of a story that started months earlier. If Suzanne had been thinking about leaving, if the marriage had been changing, then May 2020 wasn't random. It was a collision point, a moment when the future arrived early. And someone may have decided the future was unacceptable. That is the darkest possibility, and it's why people keep returning to this file. Because it contains the most terrifying question we never want to ask ourselves. What happens when a life behind closed doors reaches a breaking point, and nobody outside is there to see it? And when the breaking happens, the first thing the world sees isn't the truth. It's a staged scene. A bicycle, a helmet, a story meant to guide the investigation away. And that story might have worked if the body was never found. But the body was found, and the evidence returned the case to the hands of reality. That's why Suzanne Morphew is not just a missing person case. It is a lesson in how disappearances become battles between narratives. And the truth doesn't always win fast. Sometimes it crawls back years later, buried in the ground, carrying chemical signatures that speak for the person who can't speak anymore. Now, if you're still here, you understand why the Suzanne Morphew case isn't leaving the public mind. It's because it's not just one mystery. It's multiple mysteries stacked on top of each other. Mystery 1, what happened on Mother's Day? Mystery 2, whether the bike was staged. Mystery 3, the meaning of the helmet. Mystery 4, why the case collapsed in 2022. Mystery 5, what it means that her remains were found years later far from home. Mystery 6, what the BAM tranquilizer evidence implies. Mystery 7, whether the body was moved. Mystery 8, what will happen next in court. And each mystery feeds the next. This is why the case is both red ocean and still profitable. Because it never truly becomes old. Keeps reopening itself. The story keeps producing new chapters. And the moment a new chapter appears, people return. The difference is what angle you choose. Most channels cover the case like a recap. They list details. They summarize headlines. But that's not our approach. Our approach is cinematic investigation. We treat the file like it's in our hands. We treat the last photo like it matters. We treat the timeline like a weapon. And we treat the silences like evidence. Because silence is a language too. When Suzanne vanished, the world wanted a simple story. But the case gave them a complex one. And complex cases expose the difference between entertainment and truth. They force audiences to sit inside uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. But discomfort is where attention lives. That's why your title and thumb strategy works. Because you're not promising gore. You're promising a crack in the story. You're promising that something doesn't add up. And people click because humans can't resist unresolved patterns. They want to close the loop in their mind. They want to complete the puzzle. And when the puzzle involves a family photo, it becomes emotional. Because families are supposed to be safe. Home is supposed to be safe. A mother is supposed to come home. When that doesn't happen, the brain treats it like a violation of reality itself. That's why missing mothers become high-impact cases. They break the audience's sense of order. Now here is the final turn, the final heartbeat of the story. Even if a verdict comes, even if the system says guilty or not guilty, there will always be a part of this case that remains unresolved. And that part is the one Suzanne took with her. The private truth of her final hours. What she saw, what she felt, what she realized. Whether she had a moment where she understood danger. Whether she believed she would live through it. That's why these cases haunt people. Because the victim's voice is always the missing piece. The investigation can reconstruct timelines and chemical evidence, but it cannot reconstruct the exact moment a person realized they were no longer in control of their future. And in domestic noir cases, that moment is the horror. The realization that the threat was not outside. It was inside the system of your life. And once you realize that, there is nowhere to run. Because home is where you keep your guard down. Home is where you trust. Home is where you sleep. That's why the quietness of this case is so disturbing. If intoxication was involved, if BAM was used, then the ending may have been silent. A person losing consciousness. Person unable to fight. Person unable to scream. And that is a kind of violence that doesn't leave the dramatic scars people expect, but it leaves the deepest absence. It leaves a hole that a family can't fill. And it leaves the world with a question it can't stop asking. Who had access? Who had motive? Who had opportunity? Who had the ability to manage the aftermath? And if a body was moved, who had time? Time is always the hidden currency of crime. People can commit acts in seconds, but hiding them requires time. Managing them requires time. And time requires control. Someone who is panicking makes mistakes. Someone who is planning buys time. Someone who is calculating creates distance. That's why the remains being found far away matters. Not because it proves one narrative, but because it suggests movement beyond what accident or abduction would easily explain. It suggests a decision. And when you strip everything down, that is what this case is about. Not accident. Not abduction. Decision. A decision that ended Suzanne's life and began a case file that refused to close. This is why we end with a question. Not because it's a gimmick. Because it's the only honest way to treat a case that still lives in uncertainty. What would you do if you were one of Suzanne's daughters? Watching the world debate your mother's disappearance like a story. What would you do if you were her friend? Hearing details you never knew about her private life after she was gone. What would you do if you were the investigator holding the last photo, trying to build a case that has already been damaged once by the system? And what would you do if you lived in a relationship that looked fine in photos, but was breaking in silence? Because the most terrifying part of Suzanne Morphew is not just the crime. It's the reminder. The reminder that a family can look perfect right up until the moment someone disappears. And by the time the world notices, it's already too late. If this case made you think, if it made you see why timelines matter, if it made you question the difference between what's said and what's true, subscribe to Family File Mysteries. And comment below. Do you think the bicycle was the first clue? Or the first distraction? Because in cases like this, the line between evidence and misdirection is where the truth hides. There's something else about this case that most people don't admit out loud, and it's the reason it keeps pulling audiences back in, because the Suzanne Morphew file doesn't just sit in the category of true crime. It sits in the category of what if, and what if is the most addictive word in human psychology. What if the bike was staged? What if the helmet was moved? What if the story was designed to buy time? What if the truth was never meant to be found? What if Suzanne's last private moments weren't dramatic at all? What if they were quiet, controlled, efficient, What if the most important action in the entire case happened without anyone outside hearing anything? What if she never even had a chance to understand what was happening? What if that's why the evidence is so difficult to tie to a single moment, because this wasn't a public explosion, it was a private shutdown? That is the nightmare scenario in domestic noir, the idea that a life can be ended without the world ever witnessing the transition from normal to catastrophe. And the reason the last photo angle works so well is because the last photo is the last moment the world sees the illusion of safety, and that illusion is what makes people click, because they want to know what broke it. But when you study disappearances, you realize something uncomfortable. You realize that the thing that breaks safety isn't always a stranger. It's often a shift inside the home, a shift that starts as tension, then becomes distance, then becomes fear, and finally becomes silence. And silence is not neutral. Silence is active. Silence is a choice. Silence is how secrets survive. And this case has always been full of silence, not just the silence of Suzanne being gone, but the silence of what truly happened behind closed doors, the silence created by legal collapse, the silence created by time, the silence created by a body that was missing for years. And when a body is missing, truth becomes negotiable. People can argue forever, but when remains are found, truth becomes heavier, it becomes physical, it becomes undeniable. Suzanne was not living somewhere else. Suzanne did not choose to vanish and start over. Suzanne's story ended in death, and once you accept that, you have to accept the next truth too. Her death required something. It required a cause, it required a sequence, it required decisions, and when you trace decisions in domestic cases, you rarely find randomness, you find pressure. Points, you find motives that aren't always loud, motives that aren't always financial, motives that are often psychological: control, exposure, fear of losing, fear of shame, fear of a future that doesn't match the one you promised the world. That's why when investigators hear about relationships under stress, they don't dismiss it as gossip, they mark it as context. Context is the map of motive, and motive is the engine behind many disappearances. And even though motive is not proof, it is the reason investigators keep circling back to the inner circle. And in Suzanne's case, that circle has always been tight, because there were only so many ways for this story to unfold. Either an accident happened and the scene is misleading, or an abduction occurred and the evidence is incomplete, or the disappearance came from within the home and the staging was meant to push the case outward. Those are the three broad doors, and every clue in this case seems to push against the first two doors and lean toward the third. Not enough for strangers to convict someone in a courtroom, but enough for investigators to stay focused, and enough for prosecutors to try again after a first attempt collapsed. And that alone tells you something. Prosecutors don't reopen what they don't believe they can win. They don't step into fire unless they think the evidence can hold. And the evidence they believe can hold in this case isn't one dramatic thing, it's a pattern, a chemical signature. Location discovery, a possible movement of remains, and a narrative that never stayed still. And the reason narratives don't stay still is because a stable truth doesn't need adjustment. People don't edit a story that's solid. They only edit a story that needs to survive pressure. And pressure in a missing person case is relentless. It comes from law enforcement, from media, from family, from the public, from time. And every day someone stays missing, pressure increases, and that pressure reveals how a person handles crisis, whether they collapse, whether they cooperate, whether they disappear, whether they manage details. And management is what investigators notice, because innocence is often chaos. Guilt is often control, again not always, but often enough that it becomes a pattern you can't ignore. And Suzanne Morphew became a symbol because the case exposes how fragile normal life can be, how quickly a home can become a crime scene without ever looking like one. And if you're listening to this story and you feel uneasy, that's the point. It's not entertainment discomfort, it's reality discomfort, the discomfort of knowing that missing person cases are rarely about the moment someone vanishes. They're about the life that made vanishing possible. And this is why family file mysteries will focus on family secrets. Not because secrets are sensational, but because secrets are structural. Secrets are the beams holding up the false version of a life. And when those beams break, the truth falls out, sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And in Suzanne's case, the truth fell out over years, first as suspicion, then as arrest, then as collapse, then as remains, then as forensic chemistry, then as renewed prosecution. And now we're waiting again, waiting for the system to decide what the evidence means beyond headlines, because this case is still alive. And if you think the story ends when a body is found, you don't understand how justice works. Finding remains is not the end, it's the beginning of the hardest part, proving exactly how, proving exactly who, proving exactly why. And if prosecutors fail again, the case might become a permanent open wound, not because the truth doesn't exist, but because the truth cannot be proven in the only language the court accepts. And that is the tragedy, because courts don't deliver truth, they deliver verdicts. And a verdict is not always the same thing as reality. Now imagine the final hours of Suzanne's known life not as a dramatic scene but as a slow tightening, a day that looks ordinary from the outside, but feels different from the inside, the kind of day where a person is living with a decision, the decision to leave, to confront, to change, and that decision is like a seed of chaos in domestic environments, because domestic environments depend on routine, they depend on predictability, they depend on people playing roles without questioning them. And when someone breaks a role, the entire structure shakes, and when a structure shakes, the person who benefits from the old structure feels threatened, and threatened people behave in ways they never believed they were capable of. This is why true crime is not about monsters. It is about ordinary people reaching their limit, and Suzanne's story is a reminder that limits exist even in quiet mountain towns. It's a reminder that a family photo is not proof of safety. It's a reminder that the official story is often the first version, not the final one, and the reason the Suzanne Morphew case turned into what it turned into is because the first version never stayed stable, it cracked under its own contradictions, and once a story cracks, investigators start listening differently, they stop hearing what happened, and start hearing what is being protected. Because lies are rarely random, lies have purpose, lies are shields, and shields exist because something behind them is vulnerable, and what was vulnerable here, at least as the public reporting suggests, was a marriage under pressure, a life that might have been changing, and when lives change, people either accept the change or fight it, and in cases like this, the fear is that someone fought it in the worst way possible. Now the file is open, and the reason we package this as the last photo is because the last photo is the last moment that cannot be argued. It is the last moment confirmed. It is the last moment beyond opinion. Everything after that becomes contested. Everything after that becomes narrative. Everything after that becomes courtroom language and defense strategy and prosecution theory. But the last photo is pure. It is a timestamp in human form. It says she existed, she was alive, she had a face, she had a future, and then she didn't. And the gap between those two states is what this entire case is built around. The gap is where murder lives, or accident lives, or abduction lives, and investigators cannot tolerate gaps. They fill them with work. They fill them with maps, phone pings, witness statements, receipts, travel logs, interviews, because every gap can be closed if enough truth survives. But sometimes truth doesn't survive. And when truth doesn't survive, people live inside theories forever, and theories become poison, because families can't heal around theories. They can only heal around answers, and answers are what Suzanne's case has refused to provide cleanly. Even with a body, even with forensic evidence, because evidence can suggest without showing, it can imply without demonstrating in front of a jury, and that's why prosecutors face the hardest problem in modern true crime. How do you prove a domestic crime that may have been quiet, controlled, and delayed by time? How do you prove intent? How do you prove sequence? How do you prove the exact moment a life ended? And that's why this case is so important as a story, not because it is popular, but because it represents a type of crime that is becoming the new horror, the horror of invisibility. A person gone, no clear scene, no clear moment, only objects left behind that may have been placed there to mislead. And people who want to argue innocence love invisibility because it creates reasonable doubt, and prosecutors hate invisibility because it forces them to build a house of proof without a foundation. And that's why the 2022 dismissal matters. It wasn't just a legal event, it was a fracture. It made the system look fragile, and once the system looks fragile, every piece of evidence becomes contested before it can even be tested. And then the remains were found and the system got a second chance. And now the question is whether the second chance will deliver what the first could not. Because Suzanne Morphew is not just a missing person case, it is a test of modern justice. And it is a test of how society handles domestic tragedy when the evidence is subtle rather than spectacular, and that is why Family File Mysteries exists, because we are not here to scream, we are here to examine, we are here to follow the shadow trail, we are here to show how a family can look stable while collapsing under the surface, and we are here to ask the questions that don't feel comfortable, because comfortable questions don't solve cases, uncomfortable questions do. And here is the final uncomfortable question of this file. If Suzanne's disappearance began with her wanting out, if she wanted a different future, then her disappearance was not random, it was a collision, and collisions in domestic life always produce debris, and investigators collect debris, not physical debris only, emotional debris, behavioral debris, the debris of a story that keeps changing. And if you want to know whether someone is hiding something, you don't look for anger, you look for edits, you look for revisions, you look for a narrative that cannot remain still, because a story that is true doesn't need to move, it only needs to be repeated, and repeated truth sounds boring, but boring is what investigators want, because boring is stable and stable is real, and this case has never been boring, it has been unstable from the beginning, a bike, a helmet, a missing woman, a public plea, an arrest, a collapse, remains found, tranquilizer evidence, renewed charges, years of debate, and still no final conclusion. And that is why we end where we began, with a photo, because a photo is the only thing that stays still in this story, the only thing that doesn't edit itself, the only thing that doesn't shift under pressure. Suzanne's face, frozen in time, telling the world she was real, and asking the world the same question it still hasn't answered: what happened to me? And the hardest part about asking that question is knowing that in cases like this, the answer might never arrive in the way people want it to arrive, because the public wants a confession, the public wants a clear motive, the public wants a scene they can visualize, a moment they can replay in their minds and label as the turning point. But real disappearances rarely offer that luxury. Real disappearances are often built from fragments, small contradictions, quiet shifts, and the invisible violence of control. And that is why this file refuses to settle, because it is a modern missing person case where the story is bigger than the scene. It is bigger than the bike, bigger than the helmet, bigger than the arrest, bigger than even the remains being found. It is a case about trust dissolving inside a home and leaving the outside world with only the outline of what happened. And people hate outlines. They want details. They want certainty. They want the comfort of a finished narrative, but certainty is rare in the real world, and that is why investigators build certainty instead of waiting for it. They build it through sequence, through accumulation, through relentless attention to what doesn't fit. And if you want to understand what makes this case so dangerous, so haunting, and so politically charged in the world of true crime, you have to understand that it forces society to confront two uncomfortable ideas at the same time. Idea one is that a missing person case can be staged, and staged cases exist because someone wanted to control the direction of the search. And idea two is that domestic spaces are not always safe, even when they look safe, even when the scenery is beautiful, even when the photos look normal. And that second idea is the one most people fight against, because believing home is safe is how people survive emotionally, it's how families function, it's how society stays stable. And when a case like Suzanne Morphew breaks that belief, it doesn't just create a mystery, it creates fear, and fear produces obsession, and obsession produces views. But views are not the goal here, truth is the goal, or at least the closest version of truth that can be reached through public information and evidence-based reasoning. And Suzanne's story is one of those cases where even the best information still leaves shadows, because the crucial actions in this case, whatever they were, happened in private, and private crimes are the hardest crimes to prove, because the only witnesses are the people inside the house, and the only one missing is the one who cannot speak. And that is the cruel design of domestic violence. It often silences the only person who could tell the story cleanly. And then the world is left with a courtroom fight between interpretations, and interpretations do not heal anyone, interpretations only divide. But evidence can heal, not emotionally but structurally. Evidence can deliver a resolution that at least stops the story from being rewritten endlessly. And that is why the renewed prosecution matters, because it is the system's chance to replace endless theory with a legal conclusion. And whether that conclusion matches reality is something people will argue about forever, because people always argue. But a verdict can at least give the family something solid to hold, even if it's painful, even if it doesn't feel complete, because pain is still easier to live with than endless uncertainty. Uncertainty is a poison that never settles, and missing person families live inside that poison every day. And that's why cases like this should never be treated like casual entertainment. They should be treated like what they are: human tragedies with real consequences that continue long after the headlines stop trending. And when Suzanne's remains were found in 2023, it gave the case weight again. It pulled it back from the abstract and into the physical world. Because a body is physical. Truth, it is a confirmation that the missing person did not choose to leave behind everyone they loved. They were taken from that life. And that truth is what makes the case irreversible. It doesn't matter what the internet believes, Suzanne is gone, and someone is responsible for that outcome, either directly or indirectly, through action or through the circumstances that were created. And accountability is what the world is waiting for. Accountability in law, accountability in story, accountability in meaning, because humans can accept tragedy more easily when it has a shape. And right now, Suzanne Morphew's tragedy is still being shaped, still being argued, still being tested. And until that ends, the file remains open in the mind of the public. But here is what I want you to take away from this case as a viewer of family file mysteries. The most important clue in any disappearance is not the most dramatic object. It's the earliest shift in reality. The first moment the story stops matching the timeline, the first moment someone's words feel like they are trying to build a version of events rather than describe one, and the first moment investigators realize the scene is speaking a language, because crime scenes are conversations, they communicate. And the bike in a ravine communicates one thing, the helmet found elsewhere communicates another. And the remains found years later miles away communicate something else entirely. They communicate time, movement, concealment, and consequence, and when you put those messages together, you get the shape of a story that is darker than an accident and more complex than an abduction. You get the shape of a disappearance that may have been designed, and design is what people fear most because accidents are random, abductions are external, but design means intention. Design means someone made a plan and executed it, and if that is what happened, then this case is not just sad, it is chilling because it means someone believed they could rewrite reality and get away with it, and for a while it may have worked because Suzanne was missing for years, the case collapsed once, and the world was left with only speculation, but reality has a way of resurfacing, sometimes literally, sometimes through remains discovered in the dirt, and that is what happened here. Reality returned, and with it came the final reminder that no matter how clean a narrative sounds, truth does not care how comfortable we are. Truth always comes back, even if it takes years, even if it arrives quietly, even if it arrives in the form of forensic chemistry instead of dramatic footage, and that is why this case is one of the most disturbing domestic mysteries of the last decade, because it shows that the most important crimes can happen in silence, and the silence can last for years before the world hears it speak. Now, there's one last thing we have to talk about before we close this file, because if you're watching this case as a viewer, it's easy to think the story is about one man and one woman, a husband and a missing wife, but the real story is bigger than that. It's about the invisible tension between public image and private truth. It's about the way families protect appearances until the appearances crack. And it's about the way society reacts when the perfect family narrative collapses into suspicion, because the world loves perfect families until it learns they weren't perfect. Then it turns them into a spectacle, and spectacle is dangerous. Spectacle turns tragedy into a game of sides. And once a case becomes a side-picking war, people stop listening to evidence, they start listening to what makes them feel right, and feeling right is not the same as being correct. That's why in Family File Mysteries we don't tell you what to believe, we show you what the timeline suggests, we show you what the evidence points toward, and we show you what still doesn't make sense, because the most honest sentence in true crime is the sentence people hate the most. We don't know yet, and in Suzanne Morphew's case, the court still has to decide what the evidence means legally, but the human meaning is already clear. A mother was lost, a family was broken, and a community became a background for a mystery that refuses to disappear. And mysteries like this are not solved by outrage, they are solved by relentless reconstruction, by taking each piece of the story and testing it against time, against behavior, against motive, against opportunity, because motive without opportunity is nothing, and opportunity without motive is empty. But when motive and opportunity overlap, the result is often tragedy, and that overlap is exactly what investigators look for, and the public doesn't always see it because the public is distracted by dramatic objects like bicycles and helmets. But objects can lie, objects can be moved, objects can be staged, but people leave patterns, and patterns are harder to fake for long, because patterns include every decision you make, every minute you spend, every way you react under pressure, and pressure reveals the truth not by force but by erosion. It erodes the mask, it erodes the stable story, it erodes the confidence, and it leaves behind the raw sequence that can't be explained away. And this case has always been about erosion, the erosion of a perfect narrative, the erosion of a stable timeline, the erosion of a family image, and the erosion of certainty. And when certainty erodes, the only thing left is the question, what happened? And in this case that question is sharpened by one fact that cannot be argued. Suzanne was last confirmed alive shortly before she vanished, and then she was gone, and she remained gone until her remains were found, and her death was treated as a homicide. And once you accept that, the final question becomes not whether this case is tragic, it's whether it was preventable, because in so many domestic cases the warning signs exist, but they are invisible to outsiders, they are hidden behind smiles, behind routines, behind family photos, and the reason the last photo hook works is because it forces the viewer to see the illusion as an illusion, it forces the viewer to admit that an image can hide an entire war, and that is why domestic noir is so terrifying, because it means the danger can live next to you while you still believe you are safe. It means the threat can share your table and still appear normal. It means the line between normal life and disaster is thinner than we want it to be, and Suzanne Morphew is a reminder of that line. A reminder that a person can vanish and the world can spend years arguing over what happened while the truth sits buried somewhere waiting to be found. And when it is found, it doesn't always arrive with clarity. It arrives with more questions. And that is what makes this file so heavy, because even with remains recovered, the case still requires proof, it still requires sequence, it still requires the kind of certainty that courts demand. And if that certainty comes, it will come through evidence, not through opinion. And if it doesn't come, the case will remain one of those modern mysteries that haunts the public mind like a ghost. A missing person story that turned into a homicide investigation without ever delivering the clean ending people crave, but the clean ending is not always possible. Sometimes the only ending is awareness. Awareness that these stories are real, awareness that families can hide fractures, awareness that the most dangerous moment in a relationship is often the moment of change, the moment someone wants to leave, the moment someone feels exposed, the moment someone feels control slipping, and if you take anything away from this case, let it be this: the most important evidence in any disappearance is not the object found on the road. It is the truth that was building in the days before, the truth that existed inside the home before the world ever noticed anything was wrong. And that truth is what investigators try to pull into the light, because once it's in the light, it cannot be controlled anymore. And control is what these cases are always fighting against: control of narrative, control of timeline, control of image, control of what people believe, but evidence doesn't care about control. Evidence is stubborn, it waits, it persists, it returns, and that is why even after years, Suzanne's case returned, first through renewed focus, then through remains, then through forensic findings, and now through renewed prosecution. The file is still alive, and it is still demanding an answer, and until the answer comes, the last photo remains exactly what it has always been: a quiet accusation against the idea that everything was okay, a reminder that the truth was hiding in plain sight. And the most terrifying thing about truth is that once you see it, you realize you were living next to it the entire time, and you never knew. This is Family File Mysteries, and this was the case file that began with Mother's Day and ended in silence. If you want more investigations like this, subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you believe the bicycle was evidence, or was it a message? Because sometimes the difference between clue and distraction is the difference between a mystery that lasts forever and a truth that finally breaks through.